institution. So more than 30 years. We've, of course, had a senior scholar and Charles Haynes working with us a great deal, but we've established the Religious Freedom Center here to do basic education. I think you might call it almost religious freedom literacy, but also to help Americans understand where the intersection is between religion and public policy. We find, in part, you mentioned talking about the media, that the ability to learn about religion through various forms of media is greatly down from where it would have been 2 decades ago. We actually did a survey in the mid-90s, repeated that, I think, around 2004, and we found that the number of religion writers in America had peaked, and along with the decline of a lot of other jobs in journalism had gone away. So we think it's essential when you tackle these very tough subjects about the first 16 words of those 45 words. Thank you for reading them, by the way. That people have a sort of fundamental understanding of what religious liberty means in the United States under the First Amendment, a sort of a core examination of various belief systems, again, as you I think have so well put them out, because I think it's essential not to come at this from an emotional standpoint. Religion obviously is a very powerful motivator.
Right.
But when we're talking about religious liberty in the United States or elsewhere in the world, so much of it is driven by passion, and we hope to drive it by a reasoned argument, civility, to try and tackle this very tough subject, I think, for a lot of people. And before I forget, on behalf of my colleagues at the Newseum and the Newseum Institute, we're glad to have you here. Again, this is, I think, an essential discussion, this kind of discussion going on here for the future, really, of religious freedom in America.
Absolutely. You actually bring up a very interesting point that I've heard ministers and apologetics people talk about, is that people are never converted to a religion on the basis of an argument, of intellectual argument. It's usually something very emotional that draws them to the religion, rather than the actual, here are the facts, here's the, information that defends this religion as objective truth. That's not what people convince people. It's usually an emotional connection that they find somewhere. Kristina, your opening statement, I wanted you to eventually talk about the blasphemy laws that are out in the world and that they're increasing, but give us an opening statement that actually what you really like to focus on.
I'm Cuban American, which I think makes me almost Greek. Thank you. I think we have the same passion. My father escaped Fidel Castro's Cuba. My mother is German, and she's was in a concentration camp in Germany. So we grew with a very strong commitment to freedom of speech and freedom of religion. I am currently the Vice Chairwoman of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom. Many of you know what that does. I'll give you a brief explanation. It's the only commission of its kind in the entire world that does nothing but religious freedom. So we look at religious freedom situations in about 37 countries. The State Department has a larger portfolio of all the countries in the world, roughly 190. And we look at it from an international standard perspective, not the First Amendment perspective, although I do love the First Amendment. My family is very committed to the First Amendment. Sometimes we think a little bit too much, but it's, I love being an American. I love living in the freest country in the world. This is an unpaid volunteer position. It's 9 commissioners. We come from all sorts of backgrounds from both political parties. I was appointed by the Speaker, of the House. And we travel on bipartisan delegations. I think we're the last place in Washington, D.C. where we have Democrats and Republicans sitting right next to each other and agreeing on something as vital as religious freedom. This year, I've traveled to Saudi Arabia, Egypt. I was there shortly before the December bombings and shortly before the subsequent bus bombings. I was at Oxford talking about the intersection of religious freedom and women's rights. And I just came back from Turkey, where I was one of the 2, my colleague, Commissioner Sandra Jolly, and I were the only people that were able to visit Pastor Andrew Brunson, who, as you know, is a Christian pastor who lived in Izmir for 23 years and is now being held under charges of being a Gulenist. If the charges go forward, he will maybe spend the rest of his life in prison. And about 10 days ago, I was in Myanmar, where we were looking at the situation with the Rohingya Muslims. Just saying that word alone in Myanmar is, it freezes the debate. It's a big problem. So we look at these issues, and our mandate is to issue a report at the beginning of each year that covers these 37 countries. And this report is meant to include recommendations for the president, for Congress, and for the Department of State on how they deal with religious freedom. I have seen in my other hat, so to speak, I'm passionate about using social media to spread good news and truth. And what that means is currently, just in Myanmar, for instance, in 2002, it cost $1,500 to buy a SIM card. Now it's $1.50. 88% of people in the Middle East who are online use social media daily. One of the largest users of social media is Saudi Arabia. So I also want to speak, if we have time, a little bit about the fact that we should be using the tools that we currently have. They're inexpensive, they're accessible to all. Finally, I want to thank you all for coming. I know that this is a big issue, and a lot of people feel that it's almost too much to deal with, and they walk away from it. But life is short and fragile, and we are meant to be invested in a cause that's bigger than ours. So I want to thank you for coming, and I hope that at the end of the conference, you each have something that you can take back to your neighborhood, to your church, to your family, about what we can do to address this horrific situation that is ongoing all over the world, having to do with the persecution of Christians. Thank you.
Right, and Nathaniel, just an opening statement just about things about journalists actually getting the facts right, because this is one of the things that, as journalists, they should be doing, but perhaps their understanding of religion may not always allow them to get certain information in the proper context.
Sure. And one thing I would just add is that given that I come from a family that's half English, I could say I'm probably the opposite of being Greek in some ways. So, very different from Kristina.
We still love you.
Yeah. So as is mentioned, we do have the freedom of the press, not just here in the United States, but in other parts of the world, at least in principle. But freedom of the press, if it's not exercised well, is not sufficient. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to very quickly go through some essential sort of facts or context that are very important for journalists to bear in mind as they're covering these sorts of issues. I'll talk a little bit about some things that are particular to government persecution, as well as persecution from non-governmental actors, groups like ISIS. And then I'll quickly go through a list of recommendations that I actually have for journalists. Getting the facts right, getting the context to surround those facts is particularly important when you're talking about individuals, communities, and properties that are at risk. As we're seeing in many parts of the world, in particular in the Middle East, the very existence of these communities is actually on the line. And so I think that's why taking the time to get those facts right, to get the context in place is so important. I think what's unfortunate is that a lot of media outlets, or at least reporters, seem to have a different set of reporting standards for religion than they do for other topics, whether they're covering the environment or labor issues or something else. And so having the same standards that you have when covering other issues is critically important. One important question that journalists need to ask when it comes to religious persecution is, how do communities understand themselves? It isn't just a matter of what you as the journalists think about these communities, but how do these communities actually define and understand themselves? It's also worth noting, of course, that smaller religious communities, like Christians in many parts of the world, they face threats that are not faced by majority populations. Iraq, which is something that I have done a lot of work on over the past year and had a chance actually to go to a few days before Christmas last year to Erbil. I was there with the co-chairman of the commission, Congressman Chris Smith, at the invitation of the Chaldean Catholic Archbishop of Erbil, Archbishop Warda. So I'll be speaking, a lot of the examples that I'll be giving will be drawing from my experience with Iraq. But the Shia in Iraq, for example, were objectively targeted for genocide. There's no question about that. That's why 2 consecutive secretaries of state said so. But they don't face an existential crisis in the way that Christians or Yazidis do. That community is not at risk of literally disappearing from the country. So journalists need to bear in mind, what are the threats that these smaller communities face that are unique to them? Another factor that I think doesn't get a lot of attention is forced migration. So in the case of both Iraq and Syria, you have huge percentages of Christians that have been forced to flee, not just their homes, but the country altogether. In Iraq, for example, prior to 2002, so prior to the Iraq War in 2003, there were as many as 1.4 million Christians in Iraq. That number was down to 500,000 just before ISIS in 2013, and now it's less than 250,000. They haven't all been killed. Many of them have been, but many of them have been forced to flee. So forced migration is another huge stress on these communities. If one particular community is getting targeted, reporters should ask, are other communities being targeted as well? Certainly the Yazidis were the most well-known in the case of ISIS persecution. I don't think anyone would argue that in terms of scale and severity, they had it worse than everybody else. But ISIS didn't restrict its persecution to Yazidis alone. They were also targeting Christians and other communities, and yet that was an aspect of the story that many journalists just overlooked. Another fact that in violent conflict, smaller religious communities are often disproportionately targeted and affected, something that journalists need to pay attention to. An issue that Christians face in the Middle East in particular, but in other places as well, is the perception that they are outsiders, that they're not actually indigenous. Obviously, in the case of the Middle East, they've been there longer than anybody else. They've been there for 2,000 plus years, so that's a threat that they often face. And then finally, in terms of sort of context and facts, look at the dynamics within and between religious communities. We had a panel at the Helsinki Commission a few months ago, and a panelist who's actually affiliated with Under Caesar's Sword noted that Christian communities in Central Asia, for example, often don't collaborate with each other when it comes to responding to issues of persecution, lingering issues related to communism, current repression, etc. But there's another factor. When it comes to government persecution and non-government persecution, governments rarely only violate freedom of religion. They almost always also violate freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and freedom of expression as well. So it's often happening in that broader context, their desires for control. When it comes to terrorists and jihadists in particular, it used to be that their primary way of sort of spreading their message, of letting the world know who they are and what they were doing, was by talking to reporters. Now, because of social media, we've seen this in particular in the case of ISIS, they can pump out their propaganda at will with hundreds and hundreds of pieces being released every day. So they're less reliant on journalists, which makes due diligence even more important. There's a very interesting book written by a journalist named Saoud Makanet. She, Turkish, Moroccan, German. She grew up in Germany. Who wrote a book called I Was Told to Come Alone. Because she's a woman, because she's a Muslim, and because she's actually descended from Muhammad, she has had almost unparalleled access to these jihadis over the years, and has written a really fascinating book about. I realize I'm close to time, but I'll just, if I could go through these very quickly. So just a few sort of ways in which reporters and news outlets can do the kind of things that I've outlined. I think number one, in addition to dedicating standalone stories to the topic, include this issue in the context of broader stories. If you're writing about a crisis, if you're writing about a country or a region or an event, even if you're not dedicating the entire story, look to see if there are issues related to persecution that you can actually include in the stories. If you've done a story, whether it's a standalone story or incorporated into something else, follow up. Usually these stories, these issues, these crises for these communities are not one-off. They're ongoing over months, maybe even years. So make sure to track them and to follow up. Look at individuals, yes, and in particular, the stories of individuals are compelling ways to tell these stories, but look at communities as well. One of the real challenges we had, in particular with the previous administration, when it came to Christians in the Middle East, they would, and assistance to them, they would only look at individuals. They would not look at them as communities. So look at communities as a whole. If you're looking for story ideas, monitor religious communities. There are advocacy groups that are talking about these issues. There's the religious press as well. There's USERF. There's commissions like the Helsinki Commission. Great stories, ideas can come from that. If you have journalistic colleagues in the region, talk to your colleagues, see what they're seeing. Ask the U.S. government, are you aware? What are you doing about this? Ask Congress, what are you doing? What are you aware about this? In the case of Congress, there are members that are particularly active on these issues. Go to those offices, talk to their staff. Prioritize contacts, letting contacts lead to other contacts, speaking on deep background. That's often the way in which you're able to get a lot of the important information. Connect with sources on the ground. And then finally, there's a diaspora for all of these groups in the United States. It's part of our kind of tapestry here in the US. There are a lot of interesting and complicated dynamics between diaspora groups that reporters need to be aware of, but they can often lead you to contacts and sources on the ground and are a great source of information as well. So I realize I've gone over time, but I'll stop there.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Nathaniel. And I want Mr. Shah to give us his opening statement.
Sure.
And I mean, I think one of the questions I want to ask, and it's really more of a rhetorical question, is why should we care? What should we do about it? That sort of thing.
Thank you. Thank you, Lauren, and thanks to all of you. Thanks to the leaders of this third Archon International Conference on Religious Freedom. It's a great honor to be with you. And let me also say that as an Indian American, I feel particularly close to Greek Americans as well. We Indian Americans love food, family, faith, and big weddings. So we feel particularly close to Greeks. I think I attended a small wedding in Bombay about 20 years ago with 5,000 people. You know, and coming in to the conference today, I think I met three physicians, one after another. So as an Indian, I felt, you know, right at home. Well, I do want to talk about the question that Lauren raised, why should we care, just briefly, and then also talk a bit about how can we be more effective in responding to the global epidemic of the persecution of Christians. And first, let me applaud the Archons and the Ecumenical Patriarchate for consistently raising this issue of the persecution of Christians around the world, particularly in countries like Turkey, countries in the Middle East, the Holy Land, but also many other places around the world. Research that I've been a part of suggests that the number of Christians that live in countries where they are subject to severe persecution is 500 million. By 2020, that number will probably be 600 million. Something like 20 to 22% of the global Christian population lives in countries where they are subject to severe persecution. This is a global humanitarian and human rights catastrophe, and yet it is not being adequately covered. So it really is crucial for us to answer the question, why should we care? Why are we not caring enough? And it is a fact, and I am sorry to say, that most of the comfortable Christians who live in comfortable parts of the world are not like you. They're not organizing conferences like this. They're not lobbying the way you are. They're not organizing themselves. They're not even aware of what is going on. So we need to figure out how we can mobilize more of our brothers and sisters to do what you are doing, that is to respond in solidarity in an effective way with Christians who are facing persecution. Along with a colleague at Notre Dame, Daniel Philpott, I was part of a project called Under Caesar's Sword, which produced a report called In Response to Persecution. We've produced a documentary film We've tried to understand how Christians themselves are responding to persecution so that we can come alongside them and assist them, exercise effective solidarity with them, and, as it were, strengthen and support their response. And it was also instructive to see how Christians themselves are already responding to persecution. So based on what we've seen Christians around the world already doing, based on the research we've done in some 25 countries, I have just a couple of thoughts which I'll briefly talk about. Why should we care, and how can we be more effective? First, one reason that we should be more concerned has to do with our theology. We, as Christians, have an extraordinarily rich theology that explains why we should care about religious persecution. Our theology says that every human being has been created in the image of God, and we have been recreated by Christ. Our human nature has been recreated and elevated by Christ through his resurrection and ascension, such that every human being and the freedom of every human being are of literally infinite worth and value. And yet, we often do not act on that theology. But that theology gives us a powerful reason to care. And if I may say, it is, in fact, Orthodox theology, the theology of Basil of Caesarea, of Gregory of Nyssa, the theology of St. John Chrysostom, that, in fact, laid the foundations for understanding human beings as created with a radical freedom to know God, to come into communion with God, and wherever that freedom is denied, wherever that freedom is marred, we must stand up. We should care, especially when it concerns the freedom of our brothers and sisters in Christ, but not only our brothers and sisters in Christ. All people are created with infinite worth and dignity, and therefore we have a theological warrant, a mandate, to respond more effectively and more energetically. But there's also a secular reason. If people are not moved by the theological reason to care about human freedom and dignity, there are powerful secular reasons. And these are the kinds of arguments we need to make to policymakers and to others. And the most powerful, or one of the most powerful secular reasons to care about religious freedom and religious persecution is because religious freedom is inextricably related to other freedoms. And this gets back to the topic of the panel, religious freedom and its relationship to freedom of the press and other freedoms. I would argue that religious freedom is the thin end of the wedge of freedom. Where you have even a modicum of religious freedom in society, where people can think about ultimate questions for themselves without being coerced by the state, where they can come to their own conscientious judgments about ultimate truth, where they can organize themselves. In the long run, that society, even if it does not have other freedoms, is going to become a freer society. In the 1970s and 1980s, the government of South Korea was a radically authoritarian police state, but it allowed a modicum of religious freedom. Because it allowed religious freedom, churches in South Korea were able to organize, mobilize, and eventually overthrow the authoritarian regime in South Korea. That kind of story has played out over and over again across human history. The reverse is also true. Where countries drastically restrict religious freedom, it's going to be very difficult for other freedoms to be respected. It's no accident that Turkey has one of the highest levels of religious restrictions in the world, and also one of the highest levels of restrictions on freedom of the press. It's no accident at all. They're inextricably related and bound together. It's no accident that Egypt, which is increasingly going after the freedom of NGOs to operate charitable institutions, the freedom of Copts to build and rebuild their churches, the freedom of Muslims to organize civil society organizations. It's no accident that that country is becoming more and more unfree in many, many other areas. Well, so how can we respond to this problem more effectively? I won't spend a lot of time on this. We can discuss this more in the course of the question and answer. But I have two thoughts. One picks up on something that Nathaniel Hurd pointed out. One is that Christians need to be better at working with other Christians. In country after country that I've worked on, countries like India and Sri Lanka and other countries, I have found that Christians themselves, even though they are together facing a problem of persecution either from the state or from non-state institutions, often have failed to build bridges with each other, have often failed to bridge umbrella organizations under which they can advocate together for their freedom. Yet we have seen countries where Christians have begun to do this. Non-Orthodox Christians in Russia have formed an umbrella organization and are therefore far more effective in advocating for their freedom in Russia. Countries where Christians have worked together have seen greater progress on religious freedom. Second thing that we can do to be more effective is it's crucial for those who advocate for religious freedom, including Christians who advocate for their religious freedom, build stronger relationships with secular NGOs. Because human rights are so inextricably bound up with each other, because religious freedom can't be separated from the freedom of association or freedom of the press or the freedom from torture and so on. We need to do a better job of building bridges with secular advocates of so-called secular human rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, all of you. Before we go into more of the Q&A with the panelists, I want to just recognize His Eminence Archbishop Demetrios, who's been here for all of these sessions, and your spiritual presence is really very comforting for me, as well as all of us here, to know that someone of such great faith is here, and this is not just a sort of, let's just talk, but we've got a spiritual guide here as well. I am not Greek, as you might guess, but my husband is, so that my better half is Greek. One of the things that I wanted to talk about, because it was very interesting, because I covered this a lot in news, is this idea of blasphemy laws. Mm-hmm. You're talking about the power structure, Tim, about the power structure of a government and how they suppress and oppress people, and that comes through laws. Blasphemy laws are something that actually becomes the tool through which you can then persecute Christians. Explain what these laws are and how pervasive they are.
Sure. So all of the United States Commission on International Religious Freedom decided to commission a study on blasphemy laws around the world. And we expected to find a number of them in Pakistan, and we expected to find some, I'm sorry, Tim, in India. But we did not expect to find them in Canada, in Switzerland. And so what blasphemy laws basically are, they're a prohibition of offending people that have different religious beliefs. There's different wording in each country. So for instance, in places like Canada, you'll find them saying, do not offend other people. The Canadians are very nice people, as we all know that. So of course, some places they're good intentions, but they make terrible, terrible laws. So at USERV, we are currently keeping a list of individuals who have been prosecuted for this. Unfortunately, the poster child for this is a woman, Asia Bibi, in Pakistan, who was standing by a fountain with other women from her village, and the other women accused her of having said something that was insulting to Islam. It was probably a property dispute, but she has been sentenced to death, for having said something that was perceived as insulting. So at the intersection precisely of religious freedom, we have all the other rights. All the other rights are interdependent with each other. They're universal. And when you try to take one right out, like freedom of speech, in the name of let's not be offensive to others, then you have a chasm that happens with religious freedom. Currently, there are thousands of people that are permanently in jail of all religious traditions and all beliefs. In Bangladesh, if you're an atheist and you go on a blog and you speak about anything having to do with that may be offensive, you go to jail. In Turkey, and by the way, I should have mentioned earlier, I had the great honor of meeting with the Ecumenical Patriarch when we were in Turkey, and we spoke about the difficulties that you know better than I do. But in Turkey currently, because there's a state of emergency, if you're a member of parliament and you say something that offends Islam or the state, you go to jail, you lose your salary. So imagine being a member of parliament, not being able to criticize your own government, or not being able to say something that someone else can say it's offensive. So again, I invite you to look at that blasphemy report that we have, and maybe we can ask our brethren in Canada and Switzerland at a minimum to repeal these laws. And I mean, we were born to offend each other, right? If we all live just in our heads, it makes for a poor democracy, and it makes for a poor place. And as Tim Shah was mentioning, of course, then that also affects the ability for people to live according to their deeply held convictions and being able to talk about it. It makes for schizophrenic citizens when you have people that can think and believe something, but they're unable to say it.
That brings up the issue, though, and I think, Jean, we might kind of fill in on this, do we have some sort of kind of almost tacit blasphemy laws here in the US that journalists sort of adhere to when they report on religion or religious freedom, or just the ideas of what constitute hate speach?
Well, you've introduced a new factor with hate speech, but let's go first on the blasphemy idea.
I went
right.
like this, but
yeah, that's okay. No, I understand your point. I think what happened now, a decade ago, with the images, the cartoons that were first published in 2005, is a good example of sort of the unintended effect of the blasphemy laws. I remember being interviewed by reporters in Europe saying, why weren't more American newspapers publishing these images? Are you afraid, or is there a tacit blasphemy, observation? And the take I had that I think still holds true was, if you look at the original publication and then the subsequent publication, a lot of it wasn't motivated by any real interest in the actual cartoons or the content. It was to show either because there's an existing law or there was a tradition in countries of having those laws that might be temporarily out of favor, that we can do it. We're going to do it. It was almost to push back. It exacerbated the circumstance because it wasn't really about the content. It was just to show you could do it. And I said, ironically, in the United States, when editors had the freedom to publish, and a few papers did, what they chose to do was to say, I can describe these in a way that informs my readers, viewers, listeners exactly what the circumstance is, and either not publish them because it's insulting to a part of our readership or listenership or viewership, or I can give people the option to go and look if they wish, but not necessarily put it on the front page and shove it in their faces.
Well, there was a double standard, actually, when those kind of cartoons came out, and people talked about the double standard, that they wouldn't publish cartoons or something that were offensive to Muslims for the Prophet Muhammad, but had no problem doing the same thing for Jesus Christ or Mary, the mother of Jesus, and those kinds of things were happening, and people bring out there's a double standard. Do you journalists self-edit when it comes to that sort of thing?
Well, we edit. I mean, by definition. I think what concerns me most is, again, the lack of people who focus full time, do what you do, so that there's a sort of core. And I was pleased to hear your recommendations rather than just there's an antagonism. I think it actually is more an ignorance and a lack of understanding of the importance in people's lives. My first editor, who happened to be a Sunday school teacher also, told me there were only really a few things that people cared about. There was sort of their children and their children's education, taxes, and religion, and that was his guiding focus. And I find today that we're consumed with other kinds of coverage, eyeballs. How many people can we get to our site, and frankly, fluff, rather than focusing on these core issues that are really important and building up an extra level of expertise. So I was glad to not hear any of my colleagues talk about an antagonism in religion, because I think it's really just an absence of it being in the Daily Digest and being in the report. So when I look at that, I think that, frankly, probably one of the reasons that those images that were offensive, and I think we can all name them, artwork and whatever, again, was to some degree, the editors I've ever talked with, was a perception that it was of interest to a large number of their readers. It wasn't a casual disregard for Christians, but it was the sense that we live in a majority Christian country. And that was more of interest than sort of an issue that might take place in a different faith, which doesn't have the numbers. I don't agree with that rationale, but I don't see it as an antagonism to Christianity. I think it's, again, maybe just a misunderstanding of where the focus ought to be, the kinds of coverage that needs to go on, and things that are really important. I mean, I think the coverage idea is that discussion ought to go on in every newsroom at every level for their communities. Because we know even in small towns, a group that is not a majority faith in a small town can often be persecuted or feel persecuted. And where's the coverage of that? Not only, in our own country. Right. So I'm up here not defending the press. I have plenty of problems with today's media, frankly.
And this is the question I also want to talk to you about, and Tim, maybe you can answer this, or Nathaniel can answer this, but basically, is religious freedom uniquely American? Because we have this First Amendment, and we stated that, government shall make no law of the establishment of a state religion. And we've had several kind of people kind of interpret that, and we're still interpreting it, obviously, with the Supreme Court and what that actually means in a manifestation. But is religious freedom, this idea that you have a right to choose your religion or change your religion, is that uniquely American?
No, I wouldn't say so. It has been respected in ways that Americans should be proud of, and it has been a uniquely important cornerstone of the American constitutional experiment. But even the Founding Fathers themselves recognized that when they sought to codify respect for religious freedom, first in a number of state constitutions, one thinks of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, authored by Thomas Jefferson. It's only one of 3 things on the epitaph of Thomas Jefferson that he was the author of that statute. Being president is not on his epitaph, but authoring that statute. And when they sought to incorporate religious freedom in the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights, they recognized that they were not inventing something. They were inheriting something. And they were inheriting the basic idea that this right to freedom of religion and freedom of conscience is a pre-political right. It's not a grant or concession from the state to individuals, and therefore not something the state can take away. It's something that the state can respect and recognize. That tradition that human nature was created to have freedom to seek and engage and align itself with the truth about God, and that this is a pre-political right goes back, as I said, to the early church fathers. The first person to use the phrase religious freedom was the church father Tertullian at the end of the 2nd century. The first time in history the phrase human right was used was to say that every person has a human right to religious freedom in the early 3rd century, also by Tertullian. And the great Orthodox fathers, Chrysostom, Gregory of Nyssa, Gregory of Nazianzen, Basil of Caesarea, all developed this wonderful theological anthropology that we have a right under God to seek the truth without coercive interference by any other party. So this is a universal idea. You can also find it outside of Christianity.
Okay, that was my next question. Yeah, is it universal? Is it unique to Christianity?
It's the core idea of the great play Antigone by Sophocles, that no state can prevent people from acting on their conscience. It's the core idea in 1st and 2nd Maccabees, where the story of Hanukkah is found. It's found in the Buddhist Emperor Ashoka, who issued edicts respecting the idea that people should respect each other's religious beliefs. The Quran contains the injunction that there should be no coercion. There is no coercion or compulsion in religion. So, in fact, I think our human nature is built in a way that any person thinking clearly can see that we were made to seek the truth in freedom, because we can only apprehend the truth if we're free. If someone tells us what to believe, then of course that automatically derails the search for truth and free inquiry. I think people see that's just a contradiction. You can't impose the truth. Truth can only impose itself.
But Nathaniel, one of the issues though is when those freedoms conflict. When you have conflicting freedoms and saying, this is my religion, these are my beliefs, and they are in direct conflict with somebody else's religion and their tightly held beliefs. And we're still in that kind of environment today, are we not?
We are. I would say, just to sort of amplify what Tim said, that first and foremost, a lot of governments in different parts of the world have actually recognized religious freedom in their constitutions. I mean, I would argue that the American Constitution is the gold standard, but many others recognize it, in some cases partially, wholly, some instances problematically, but it's there. The part of the world that the Helsinki Commission spends a lot of time focusing on, the 57 members of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, so all the countries of Europe, Central Asia, the United States, and Canada, all have committed themselves to a set of 10 economic security and human rights principles, including the freedom of religion. So whenever they argue that this is sort of being imposed on them by other governments or international institutions, it's disingenuous because they, in fact, have committed themselves to it. One thing I would say, picking up on Kristina's points about the blasphemy laws, is that in a number of countries, whether it's in the Middle East or Central Asia or elsewhere, extremism laws are being used in a very similar way to the blasphemy laws. You'll have very loosely written anti-extremism laws. It doesn't necessarily even use the language of violent extremism, it's simply extremism. And they're being used very proactively by governments to persecute particular religious communities. To your question about, well, what happens when there's a conflict, I think what we're seeing, particularly when it comes to government violations of religious freedom in a lot of the countries that we're talking about, something may be framed as sort of a conflict between one religious group or another, but in reality, it's the government taking the side of a particular religious community, usually the majority community, vis-a-vis a smaller community. So it's used as a pretext sometimes, but usually there's some other nefarious agenda that's being directed at a smaller community.
Yeah.
I think one of the great strengths of those first 16 words are that the government may neither favor nor disfavor. I mean, that's really the genius of that language, is that it places government outside really of the realm of making decisions, of favoring one faith over another. You know, we only mention faith in 2 places in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, where we don't have a religious test for office, and then when we guarantee religious freedom in the First Amendment. And I think we've had a society that in recent years has decided that pushes faith out of the public sphere, which is ridiculous. It's inimical to who we are as a nation. But I think one of the things that we're also in the grand cycle of First Amendment rights and human rights is we spent the last 80 or 90 years in First Amendment law going freedom to, what individuals can express, what can be done. And now we're really dealing with the question of, has that gone too far and what's freedom from? What the impression upon people of obligations or
well, there's
or
that
duties.
group up in Wisconsin that has that title, Freedom from Religion Foundation.
But that's really, you know, we're entering that phase, and I think we need to be cautious we don't go, again, too far when we're talking about balancing these rights in the other direction. So.
One of the things that I cover in understanding covering a religion is that you have to understand what the religion is about. And I've run into several journalists who really don't understand the tenets of the religions they're covering, if they have to cover it at all. I mean, I had a journalist come up to me during the Pope's visit and ask me frantically, "What's a Eucharist? What is that?"
That's just true.
And the idea that, and there's another story out of England where one of the priests stepped down from his position as one of the Queen's advisors because they allowed a Muslim prayer being said in the actual church service. And the prayer was the very verse that actually denied the divinity of Christ. And so journalists who don't understand why that's important will never take that story. Why would that be upsetting to a Christian, or why should it be upsetting to a Christian? Because the divinity of Christ, the resurrection of Jesus, is the cornerstone of Christianity. What you're saying is that someone who is of a different faith, who denies the divinity of Christ, comes into the church and says the scripture and nobody objects. And that's why those kinds of things are very important to understand as a journalist. When you cover religion, at least understand the tenets of the faith, to the minimum. And one of the things that happens with journalists is that they take the default mode, secular humanism, religion, and that doctrine basically says that all religions are equal. They would be equal under the law, but they're not equal. They're not the same. They don't preach the same things. They're at their core, very different. And I think that's what journalists kind of miss the point of when they're covering religion, as if it's some kind of extracurricular activity, not understanding, like, you know, Hurd Schlossberg's book, Idols for Destruction, talking about if you have a hierarchy of values, whatever's at the apex of that value is what you're worshiping. And that applies to anybody. Whether you go into a church once a week or a synagogue or a mosque or whatever you do, that's what we're all worship. We're made for worship. So, and Kristina, I mean, this is the kind of thing that you must run into when you're trying to get the word out about what you're doing. Understand, like, why is this important, and how do you explain to mainstream journalists who don't cover religion all the time why this is important?
Yes, thank you. Earlier you said that facts don't really persuade people, and that is true. So we have a situation where journalists are stretched so thin that they're not like you, going in deep and understanding what the Eucharist is, or transubstantiation, or any of these things that should be understood by people who are covering this topic. But it's also a fact that people are not persuaded by facts. I know this sounds counterintuitive. If you haven't read the book, Jonathan Haidt, The Righteous Mind, Why People Disagree About Religion and Politics, I so highly recommend it. Unless you apply the PhD formula, personalize, humanize, and dramatize what you're covering, then it's very hard for people to understand principles only. So, and this is why we also have conflicts. On the apex of value for Americans is tolerance. It's a great American value. So if you read a story about a cake baker who's denying to bake a cake for a wedding and love is love, well, that's an insult, right? And it's very hard to go in deeper to the second layer of that. If you're reading internationally about someone who refuses to participate in a national act, people generally are repulsed by this. And I'll give you the opposite example, and this is Kristina speaking personally, not a usurp. I have to throw in the disclaimer so I don't get in trouble later. But in Michigan, there is a case of 2 doctors who cut a 7-year-old girl. They performed female genital mutilation here in our country. And they are part of a Muslim community from India. So already is dealing with things that people don't like to think about, people don't like to talk about. And the group that is representing the doctors retained O.J. Simpson's attorney, Alan Dershowitz, and they retained the attorney for Dr. Kevorkian, both very well experienced in publicity. And they have said that it's a matter of religious freedom to be able to cut these girls. What a mess, because the people that have come out against the case have been accused of being Islamophobes, which is not true. And if you want to immediately be put on the defense, being accused of being anti-Muslim is one way to do it. And Alan Dershowitz, this is a practice. No one wants to talk about female genital mutilation. In fact, I wrote an article, an op-ed piece for the Wall Street Journal. My husband asked me to, after 2 days of talking about FGM, to please stop talking about it. It's understandable. It's an uncomfortable topic. But the danger that they will do to religious freedom around the world, if they are able to win in court, is unbelievable. And all Americans should be concerned by this. There's not only because there are 500,000 girls at risk in this country, but because your own religious beliefs are at risk in this country and abroad. If a harmful practice like FGM can be justified by something like religious freedom. Something you do very well as an organization is you are in the face of people who have influence, and you make sure that every year you come to Washington, you meet with the commissioners of USIP, you meet with your member of Congress. Regrettably, a lot of religions, a lot of Christians groups don't band with each other, and also regrettably, they do not understand that banding with Muslims and with Jews and with Hindus and with Sikhs and with other religions is not only important, it is vital to the survival of religious freedom, not only in this country, but around the world. And I know that takes a certain amount of bridge building and breaking barriers, but I would argue that currently religious freedom needs to be defended as the ability to live according to your deeply held convictions, whether that path takes you to religion, organized religion, or no religion at all. is a vital core right, and we cannot give up on that principle simply because the stories make us somewhat uncomfortable at times.
And this is one of the things that, I mean, I'm just playing devil's advocate because that's what I do, but also because you're talking about this female mutilation, which is, you know, and we're operating from a standard that there is a standard of objective truth. But they're operating from that same standard. And this is why I talk about the chink in the armor of the First Amendment. That once you establish that this is part of my religion, you can't take that away from me. Then you put the government in the position of deciding what is sin. Because now they have to decide based on their understanding of, you know, something is objectively wrong. Mm-hmm. But now if the religion is the freedom, right? If these are my deeply held views, who decides then what those views should be, what is right or wrong, what is objectively right or wrong? And they're saying that's objectively right, and that's why we've retained, you know, Alan Dershowitz and you know all the famous lawyers to defend us. You know.
Well, if I may add, we're the only country in the world that has a balancing test, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and Tim is an expert on this topic. But in essence, the government has a right. We can look at a sincerely held belief, right? So if you go to jail, you have a right because you have human dignity to have access to religious literature and you can practice your religion. But if you decide to establish the Church of Whiskey and Steak, the prison warden can say, hey, this is not a sincerely held religious belief, this is not a religion. But the government has a duty to protect the person, not the religious belief, to protect the person. The government has a duty to ask whether those are sincerely held beliefs. And the government, once it understands that it's a sincerely held religious beliefs, has to apply the least restrictive means. And we have seen many cases in the United States. You've heard them all, you know, the contraception, the regulation that forced most employers to provide 20 FDA-approved contraceptives, which included 4 abortifacients. An order of nuns said, and you covered this many times on your Unspirited Debate, an order of nuns said, we respect life from conception to the end, and we're not going to pay for these services. And the government said, fine, we're only going to fine you hundreds of thousands of dollars every year. You go ahead and not pay for it. And they went all the way to the Supreme Court. It is a very difficult subject to talk about in contraception, but then the court said, in fact, the government exempted Exxon and Pepsi-Cola and the largest employer in the United States, the military. So they were not applying, it wasn't a priority for the government. And also, they were not applying the least restrictive means. So compelling interest was not there because it was insincere. And I understand when you talk about the chink in the First Amendment. And it is right that when we have these issues, we don't want to be the government deciding who's right and who's wrong.
Dean?
You know, it's interesting, again, how we frame these arguments. Because we have the ability, under the First Amendment, to restrain conduct, right? We don't restrain ideas, we don't restrain concepts, we don't restrain beliefs. So when I look at the issue of female genital mutilation and laws that would prohibit that, I don't see that as an imposition, undue imposition, or deciding what's right or wrong. Because look at to me, what's the goal, if you will, for a moment, behind the mutilation? There's a belief about women and their sex lives, that this is intended to preclude, that takes the mutilation is a means to that end of a concept.
Right, that women should not enjoy sex.
Right,
that's basically
because
it.
they're tempted. You know,
well, that's it. Period. There's no religious.
Right. But it's a belief. It's a belief. So when we talk about this in terms of the government and debating on the First Amendment, you know, I don't think it's in opposition with the way we conduct ourselves across the range of the 5 freedoms to say that's conduct that we will restrain. You're free to believe what you want to believe about women who have been mutilated or not. That is not a belief we will stop you from having. You can express that belief, but we won't allow the conduct that carries that forward to mutilation of human beings, just as we wouldn't, you know, some other body part.
Jump in here, and I think Tim as well. Go ahead.
And one other thing I would just note is that while there is obviously a lot of debate and discussion about religious freedom in the domestic context, When it comes to international religious freedom, I mean, certainly some of these, there are analogous issues that are live in places like Canada and Europe, et cetera. But in particular, when you talk about people that are literally victims of genocide for their faith, people whose churches are being destroyed, people who are being rounded up by the thousands and thrown into prison, this is an area where there has actually been quite a bit of consensus among Democrats and Republicans, among people sort of across the philosophical spectrum. Kristina referred earlier to the bipartisan nature of your survey. It doesn't mean that everyone is going to agree on everything all the time, but there is a lot of consensus, and that also exists on Capitol Hill as well. And so I think it's very important that as these very important conversations and even legal fights happen domestically, that religious freedom and the protection of religious freedom doesn't get a bad name that gets in the way of promoting and defending the religious freedom of people in other parts of the world.
Tim, I know you wanted to jump in.
Yes, sure. Well, just a bit on Jean's point concerning belief versus conduct. I mean, I would argue that, in fact, the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion nor abridging the free exercise thereof, protects not just belief but conduct also, despite what the Supreme Court argued in the 19th century in the famous Reynolds polygamy case. I think the subsequent understanding in American constitutional law, also in international law, has been that religious freedom includes more than belief. It includes manifestation. Now, with respect to manifestation, practice, exercise, there can certainly be legitimate concerns and restrictions. And in the case of someone who wants to do direct damage to other fundamental human rights, if you want to throw your virgin daughter into a volcano because you think your faith requires that, if you want to mutilate your daughter and permanently damage her bodily integrity and basic bodily functioning, there's a human right that says you just can't do that. It isn't because exercise and conduct are not crucial to freedom of religion. It just means that there are conflicts often between basic human rights. The panoply of human rights respect a diverse panoply of basic human goods and interests. Religion is only one of the basic goods and interests. There are other basic human goods and interests, and religion doesn't always trump other basic goods and interests. People simply can't cite religion as a get out of the law or evade the law free card, and we just have to understand that. Now, that may lead to very difficult, complex debates in societies, but we have to have those debates.
And I also would argue, and I think that theologians would argue, and people actually cover the religious and kind of understand the idea of what religion really is that, all of us have some kind of fundamental trust. And I talked about the apex of values, a fundamental trust that really is your kind of religion in the world. We don't call it that, but we call it like belief systems or whatever. And I was at a conference a few weeks ago, and the minister talked about, all of us kind of hold our stated religion in one hand. It could be Christian, it could be Islam, but whatever it is. But in the other hand, we sort of hold the real kind of value that we're operating, our function that is really directing our lives. And these things don't always come together. When one actually challenges the other, you can actually understand which one is more important to you by which one you go with. Is it the secular humanist kind of ideas about, well, all religions are the same, or, I just think we should, march out and love everybody, or is this idea of there's a doctrine, there's objective truth that we have to abide by? And that's really the telling of your beliefs. And I wanted to also bring out this question of ideas that when they make laws today, that has to do with morality or specific things in terms of morality. And people say we can't legislate morality. We do all the time. We do it all the time. But is the objective, is the object to change the belief, right? Not just restrict the behavior. And maybe, Tim, you can start with that one.
Well, I was going to just comment, if I could, briefly on the previous wonderful point you were making about the fact we often hold or profess one kind of faith, but then operate out of a different sort of set of beliefs, and in fact treat those as more fundamental than what we say our religion is. There's a lot of, I think, misunderstanding, it seems to me, and worry that, well, a lot of the problems with religion and politics in the world today are because too many religious people are sort of flooding into public life. There's too much religion in politics. We're seeing too much religious ideology infecting politics around the world. I think that's mostly wrong. I think a lot of the worst conflicts and tensions around the world are a result of people turning politics into a religion, turning government into a religion, turning nationalisms into a religion, turning our tribal identities into creeds, turning our ethnic identities into religions, making an idol, to go back to what you were saying earlier, out of things that in fact are limited and temporal, don't really deserve to be treated as having divine status. And so the temperature of politics increases because people invest too much in politics. They see it as having ultimate value. Politics is important, certainly. Our debates about the common good are important. But the problem in India, I would say, isn't that religious people are fighting each other. The problem is that you have a movement in India that is trying to essentially make a god out of the Indian state and out of the Indian nation. And is deciding that anyone who doesn't want to treat India as having an ultimate divine status is somehow disloyal and deserves to be a second-class citizen. Over and over and again in Russia, Turkey, India, the United States, we're seeing more and more people trying to fuse tribal, national, and religious identities and turning those into a kind of god. And that's a challenge for people of faith. People who really do want to put God above merely temporal authority have to say, you can't do that. You can't treat government and political identities as our ultimate loyalties. There are things that are more important than that.
Well, the Bible actually talks about extensively idol worship. And
yes,
exactly. The second commandment basically, do not make these things an idol. And we don't understand that idols are not just statues that you bow down to, but that they can be things, they can be ideas, they can be anything that gives us an identity can become an idol. And we call them sacred cows, but I think it's more appropriate to call them golden calves.
Yeah.
It's basically
absolutely.
the idea that you can make anything an idol. Ideas, even good things, can become idols. And I want to check with everyone to see if there are questions. We want to do some questions. I see them running around picking up the cards, so I want to get to some questions.
Let me just say, Lauren, if you're permitting, we have a tremendous amount of questions, and that's a testament to this panel and a testament to the topic, which raises a lot of passions. So please bear with us, because we're not going to be able to get to all these questions. We literally have over 20, 30 questions. So we're going to try to address some of them. We're going to give Ms. Green an opportunity to read a couple of the topics, and then to continue, and we'll see how much time we have if we can address more questions. So thank you all for your questions.
Thank you so much. First question is from Commander Limbarakis. So thank you very much. You go first because you're the commander. Right. Why do you think, is it the OSCE? The OSCE that has human rights requirements does not sanction its members who are religious freedom human rights violators?
I'm assuming that question is directed to me. So one of the both strengths and weaknesses of the OSCE as an institution is that it's a consensus-based institution. So what that means very practically is that consensus about a whole range of things, whether in some cases it's basic administrative decisions or something much more dramatic, is presumed until and unless a participating state objects. And so what that means is that when everyone agrees, you have 57 countries that are all on board and moving in the same direction on something. But if a single one objects, there's obstruction. So right now, I'll give you a very concrete example. If you look at the 10 principles, economic, security, and human rights principles that have been laid out in the OSCE that all participating states have committed themselves to, Russia is actually violating all 10 in the Ukraine right now. But of course, whenever there's a move by another participating state to take action, the Russians will simply block it. Now, the flip side of that is that If you look at the European Union and some of the contentious issues that have been referred to earlier, things related to life and marriage and family, et cetera, those have really not entered into OSCE decisions and actions in quite the same way, because whether it's the Holy See or an Eastern European country or someone else will simply say, look, this is outside, you can sort of debate and discuss these things in other fora, in your own domestic settings. This is outside the boundaries of the principles that we've all agreed to, the commitments that we've agreed to, and so they'll simply block it. So there is a pro and a con, but the only time that I'm aware of a participating state actually being sanctioned was the former Yugoslavia over the genocide that was taking place there. It was a very sort of complicated procedural process, but in the end, they were sanctioned. But generally speaking, simply because of the way the entity is structured, that's the way it works. Now, that said, the institution itself has an entire office dedicated to democratic institutions and human rights, so-called ODIHR office. And they will go and they will look at particular countries and particular situations. There are special rapporteurs, special representatives that will actually issue reports about these things. They're not binding, no action is required, but at least these issues are actually being highlighted. But that's the main reason.
All right, thank you very much. This next question, I think, is for Jean, but I'm going to take part of it, too, because I think this is an interesting question that I get asked a lot. Why is the persecution of Christians ignored largely by mainstream media and, by extension, human rights organizations? For example, religious persecution was the focus of only 2.5% of reports published by Human Rights Watch between 2008 and 2011. Fewer than half of those reports focused on Christian persecution. One of the things that happens, and I know from being in a news organization, is that you've got story fatigue. It's great when the story first comes out and it's all interesting and it's the new thing, it's a new kid on the block kind of thing, but then after a while, the story doesn't go away. It's just continuing. It maintains a sort of cruising altitude, and until something happens, they sort of ignore it and they keep ignoring it. Now, the other part is just resources. Part of that is just, you've got a news organization that's got a 24/7 kind of news to fill, but they don't have 24/7 amounts of people to fill it. So you end up getting a lot of the same kind of stories repeated, or things that kind of are easy to cover, spot news like weather-related things and things that are just there. So, but Gina, I want you to answer that question as well.
Well, and I think equal parts of your answer and also your recommendations. For example, follow-up. I mean, one of my eternal complaints about journalism is that we do a terrible job of following it up. I'm really curious right now. I'd love to see, I know there's a lot of imminent stories about taxes and Flynn and all the rest, but what is life in not just Puerto Rico, but in Houston? I mean, what's happening? There isn't a lot of resource being devoted to that. Again, implicit is sort of this idea of an antagonism in that question, and I don't see it. I think it's either neglect, ignorance. One of the deceptive things about 24/7 news, and you noted about 24/7 resources, is, you have all that extra time. Why aren't all these other stories being covered adequately? 24/7 news forces you really, across the board, whether you're large or small, to take the stories that are most easily grabbed, because you're moving from here to here to here, because you have 24/7 to fill. I got into a great debate long ago now, the handoff of Hong Kong from British to China rule, on whether we were better off with coverage of really in the United States on all events international in the day when you had a correspondent who filed 6 or 8 stories but lived in that country year round, and then the story was 3 or 4 days old by the time it got on air, because of technology, versus the parachute reporter who drops in right now and says, as you can see behind me, there's a burning building or whatever. So it's the dynamics of coverage. I think it starts with educating reporters, of educating editors on the importance of this. And we've lost experts on the environment. We have lost experts on, you can name the number of experts who are no longer in journalism. 65,000 reporters, I believe, in 1996, down to 32,000 now. If you look again at the demands of filling it, camera crews go boom, boom, boom all over the place. In your business particularly, you don't have time to do research. So there has to be a fundamental shift in the nature of what journalists now consider important. I think it's credibility. It's the credible stories. It's the important stories that really have standing. And we can stop covering, celebrities and all this surface kind of material. But the kind of work that you do is extremely important. But
also, and I think, Kristina, you could probably answer this, with the advent of the iPhone and everybody becoming their own journalists, I mean, we've got this sort of no standard kind of journalism reporting out there that really becomes part of the news cycle.
Yeah, and if I may cite some statistics, and I'll be not vain and put my glasses on so I get it right. 68% of all American adults use Facebook and cite it as a place where they get their news. The cable's top-ranked channel, Fox, it has less than 1% of American adults watch Fox News on any given night. So what is happening now, and I see this a lot, is people go to the internet to confirm their own views, to get information, data that confirms their own views, not to get information to make up their mind.
In the bubble.
And in addition, I have three kids ranging 15 to 20, and they're not going to wait until the 6 o'clock news. They're going to tap into their favorite YouTuber. And what is the #1 reason people read a story on the internet? The person who retweeted or sent it to them is more important than the facts themselves. Yeah. So it's a whole brave new world out there. That's why one of the things I would love religious communities to do and religious freedom communities to do is to really learn how the systems work now in social media.
Yeah. Yeah. I think there are a couple of other issues that are going on. One is that I think there was a time when American churches were actually clearinghouses for information about the world. It was not that long ago where it was typical for in any given church, you'd have missionaries from that church coming in regularly and talking about what's going on in other parts of the world. I think there's less of that going on. I think there's just much less of a vital connection, in part because of the loss of congregational life in the United States, the growing disaffiliation of Americans from participation in religious communities. The other thing that's happening, I think, is that there is a basic ignorance on the part of a lot of American media of how robust the Christian community is in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. There's a sense that there are tiny Christian communities outside of the West. They were brought about because of Western missionary activity. There's just no real sense of the hundreds of millions of Christians who live in Asia, Africa, Latin America, the Middle East, the Near East. No, I think, kind of a clear understanding of where these communities are, what they believe, and how significant they are, and how important a part of the fabric of the national life of these countries they are.
Well, this is a question for Kristina, and I think this is a good time to bring this up. It said, when you talk about we should use social media, what does that mean exactly? Which social media, and how do we use it effectively?
Oh my.
That's a great question. The idea is to take a step back and look at all the major platforms. There are 1.8 billion people on Facebook. It is the largest country in the world right now. And you can look at videos of cute cats playing with a dog, or you can look at what's going on in ISIS, right? And then you have Twitter, and then you have Instagram. Instagram, all you do is you get a picture. Twitter just changed from 120 characters to 240. So the first thing is to learn how to use all of these platforms. By the way, the vast majority of Facebook users are older people, right?
Which is often not known. I think it's seen as
it's seen as a young person platform.
But by older, you mean like over the 20?
38 years old and,
really?
And 38 to 65.
Okay.
And Instagram is now the future of the press release for journalists. And Jean, I'm sure you have some information to add. The future, I mean, just a couple of years ago, a press release had 250 words, had the little 333 at the bottom or the little, and for those of you who have issued a press release, it had 3 quotes and et cetera, et cetera. There was this formula. The future of the press release is an Instagram. It's a picture that says, get this.
Or video.
Or a video.
Or now moving even to video.
Or a video.
Right.
And the thing is, as you know, because we live in an era when Trump is communicated directly to the American people over Twitter. And it's spreading that, but Jean, could you add to that since you're in the business of the Newseum?
I think you're absolutely right about all the the disruption is incredible, and that's another factor in coverage. Is just that long-standing media organizations and practices like the formula for a press conference or a press release, which grew up over a number of years, is just gone. And what will attract attention today is anybody's guess. There's no formula for viral kinds of things. And all the rules you mentioned, that people can go around journalists now in many, ISIS and others. That's not only made journalists not just irrelevant, it's made them targets. Because when you no longer need to talk to you to get your message out,
right,
and I'm pushing it out, if you come up with something else, you're no longer just neutral, you're an enemy of mine. So one of the factors just decreasing the number of journalists in areas where groups are being persecuted is they're just not there. They're either threatened, they're thrown out of the country, suppressed. Journalists are no longer that necessary element in the communication stream.
That actually, I've been in this business long enough to know that when we would go into any kind of neighborhood that was a little dicey, we always knew that we were somehow protected because we were journalists.
Sort of Switzerland, as you walked in.
Exactly, we were kind of, and then over the years, in the last maybe 10 years, it has become dangerous to be a journalist because it's exactly what you're saying. We don't need you anymore.
Yeah, even in countries which are democratic, where we sort of assume there's basic protection of human rights, there's been a growing series of attacks on secular journalists in India. Over and over again in the last 2 or 3 years, journalists who've attacked the Hindu nationalist government of Narendra Modi in India have been targeted and murdered. We don't think of that as happening in India, the world's largest democracy, but there are plenty of other cases where this kind of thing is happening to journalists, freedom of the press in democratic countries.
I mean, if you go into our building and you see the World Press Freedom Map, 13% of the world's population now lives in a country definably free. There are countries where freedom of the press is threatened in certain ways, but 13%, and we're talking about the freedoms being interrelated, I think that's absolutely right. But if you think about it, 13%, and if you look at the colors on the map, which are green, yellow, and red, you're going to see a concentration that does resemble religious liberty as well when you look at countries that are red and countries that are in green in terms of free. One of the great dilemmas is really in the new world in which friends are your great sort of trusted venue. Where do we get the truth? Where do we get the accurate story? And how do we make those decisions? And I think, again, credibility will become the currency for journalism in the 21st century. I think we've drifted away from that in a great many ways. For the easy story, the eyeballs, the ratings, out of economic necessity. But I think if you're going to survive now, either in the United States or worldwide, you have to have the kind of credibility that people will trust what you say. And we need to return to that.
Nathaniel wants to talk in just a second, but I want to jump off what you were saying. When I first started in this business, I remember when we were in Minneapolis and the news director had some information and she said, we can't go with this. We don't have our 3 sources before we can get out with this information. So it's the trifecta. We've got to get this confirmed within this certain amount of, information, credible sources.
And the idea you tweet it out and correct it later is absolutely false.
That was foreign, 30 years ago, but it isn't today. Nathaniel, you want to break in here?
I mean, I think my impression is that a lot of journalists, a lot of reporters get into the business because they have a sense of inquisitiveness and wonder about the world. They have a curiosity. But there's also a recognition about, for example, if I'm covering a science, I'm not a scientist, I don't know very much about it. My starting point is a posture of humility. And so my desire then is to try and, again, as I mentioned earlier, find the facts and get the right context. I'm not sure that's true in the coverage of religion, particularly for reporters that don't specialize in it. I think there's a sense that this is a sort of a fluffy topic. It simply is composed of kind of loose beliefs and opinions, and there's nothing sort of objective in the story. And that's why I would argue apply the same posture, hopefully, of humility that you would apply to any other subject that you don't know very much about to the coverage of religion as well.
I'm glad you explained what you meant by apply the same standards, because at first I was waiting to hear a little more about it, and I couldn't agree more. I think that knowledge base, again, one of the reasons we've offered on the Religious Freedom Center side is this basic training in what is faith, what is religion, what are the various religions, is just that, we hope, the start of that kind of a process, where we say to people, all right, the days when you did religion 24/7, are few and may not be coming back for the majority of reporters. Where's that base knowledge going to come from? It's not going to invent itself. So I think faith-based groups, as well as groups like ours, have to get out there and say, in various fields, understand your subject. Have at least a base understanding of what it is, so that you can do a good job, even if you are pulled off on various kinds of stories. I can't imagine trying to cover a subject as deeply held, as complex, and as important to people's lives without knowing something about it. And yet I think we throw a lot of young journalists particularly into that mission today.
I want to get to this next question because it's obviously newsworthy today, and I'd like all of you to answer this question. The question is, how will the moving of the U.S. Embassy to Jerusalem affect Christians? And I'm going to expand that to just an idea of not only affect Christians, but certainly the religious tensions in the Middle East. I can just start at the end with Tim. Why don't you just start and we'll move down?
I plead ignorance. I just have not thought deeply about this,
Okay.
and I don't have a firm view. I guess my sense is that it's not going to help Christians, though. I don't really see this as helping the Christians who are rooted in the Holy Land, I'm concerned.
Yeah, the one thing that I would say about this is that, in particular for journalists that are covering the story, whether they're covering it in the region or they're covering it remotely from here, is making sure to talk to Christians that actually live in the Holy Land, both at the leadership level, groups, but also individuals as well. I think the perspectives of Christians in the region, whether it's in the Holy Land, Iraq, or Syria, is so rarely a part of the discussion and debate. I think that there's sort of a presumption that the way that American Christians, for example, kind of across the spectrum, might view this, well, that must be the way that the indigenous communities there view it as well. And it's not necessarily the case. So this is not as much of a direct answer of consequence. It's more I suppose, a plea to just make sure that the voices and views of the indigenous Christians in the Holy Land are actually being sought out and represented in the reporting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Kristina, I've got this feeling that it's a little bit like pouring gasoline on a fire or something. I mean, is it that kind of an incendiary situation, or is it not as bad as we could imagine?
I think the perception is that it's going to throw a lot of gasoline, a lot of little fires that have been ongoing for 50 years. But this is in the defense of journalists. If all of these groups that are feeling so ardently about it had an effective communications director, they would have immediately sent out an Instagram picture with the data, and they would have immediately flooded social media with, these are the consequences of this action, for or against. But I think a lot of journalists are today wrestling with the idea of what does this mean. But on the other side, I've seen very few super effective communications directors for advocacy groups. It seems like religious freedom groups and Christian groups are so involved in their information and operate in an echo chamber where they're only talking to each other, and they have not translated their super important, vital message to the world. And this is where, even though everyone likes to rag a little bit on journalists not doing their due diligence, and I've met those, I've also had a hard time finding communications directors for religious advocacy groups that really do an excellent job in explaining issues to people, to journalists, particularly when it comes to complex issues like this one.
Yeah.
I can play editor for a second?
Yeah, and actually, but I actually just got a tweet this morning from a minister in the Middle East who tweeted out a picture of the groups burning a photograph of President Trump. So, I mean, just showing what's happening. And these are people who are actually ministers and in the Middle East, bringing the gospel there. I
mean, even though a lot of people get their news from Facebook, television remains the number one mechanism by which we get the most of our information. And so if I can be news director, maybe not editor today, this is where just the mechanics of it sometimes, I think, interfere with the reporting. This is a story made for talking heads. I mean, this is where you want to go to experts who know, to people affected. And what I saw across a range of channels, and Fox is among my viewing habits in the morning, is reporters standing at various places in Jerusalem saying, this is where we anticipate violence to occur. Now, I understood the need for that. They can't just be not somewhere to do
Because
that report.
I guarantee you there's a news director somewhere in that room that says, show me where the violence is.
And if there isn't violence, the visual is where you expect it to be. Instead of any reasoned discussion about whether this is a good idea or bad, and where are the little flames that are going to be exacerbated by if this is in fact gas. You know, I'm hungry for that. It's not an issue that I'm peripherally aware because of the work we do, but for most Americans, I don't think they've thought about it in a while. It's about 56 years since the president's decided to not move the embassy, you know, whatever. There's a history here. We don't have that in our public discussion. I mean, this is made for people who know what they're saying to talk about it.
Yes.
And we're not getting that. And so that's where I have this criticism, and I think probably along with some of your recommendations.
And if I may, here's just a perfect example where religion experts need to provide a little tutorial about the significance of Jerusalem for all the major Abrahamic faiths. Jerusalem is not just a problem of city planning, as my friend Brian Hare at Harvard Divinity School
and
likes
it's not
to
a
say.
geopolitial toy.
Yeah, and it's not a geopolitical toy. Yeah.
You know,
I want to thank all the panelists today. We are kind of running to the end of our time yet, and I've been asked to bring up a man who has a great deal to say about some solutions, about where we can go forward with this. His name is Willie Votri. He's the head of the Human Rights Without Frontiers. Willie, are you here? Right, can you come forward and talk about, I think there's a mic over here, right over here, because when we're talking about these things, sometimes we get into this circular kind of discussion where we're just talking about the problem, and I think that Willie here has some ideas for solutions, and I want to, yes, please introduce yourself and what you do, and exactly
very short.
what we're going to go forward with.
Yeah, very short. Time is money. So I'm coming from Brussels. We're Human Rights Without Frontiers. For many years, we've been covering religious freedom issues around the world. And a recurrent problem that we are facing is the silence of the media in Europe. And I think there is also the same problem here in the US about the persecution, marginalization of Christians. On one hand, when there is an anti-Semitic incident or anti-Muslim incidents, journalists, media jump on that, and politicians as well. When it concerns Christians, total silence. So there are double standards. And we think that instead of looking through the negative lens, what we have been doing for many years, and not only our organization, that we should do it through a positive perspective, and to reward journalists who particularly cover the persecution of Christians by granting such journalists an annual award. Thank you very much.
Short but sweet. And I'm sure that will be discussed as we go forward, but I think it's an interesting idea to actually hand out awards to journalists who are covering the persecution of Christians in these parts of the world, because as I said, there's a double standard. We are going to wrap up now.
We are about there, Ms. Green.
Okay.
First of all, I want to thank Lauren Green and all of our panelists for a very, very interesting presentation. We appreciate all of you being here and your expertise in that regard. The luncheon is going to be served on the 7th floor. So you're going to go out the back doors, and then you'll be directed up to the 7th floor for the lunch. Again, thank you. We could go on all day with this subject, and I have to say again that we had so many questions that we just could not get to. So thank you, Ms. Green, and thank you, panelists.